What is going on, everybody? Today we will be ranking and grading each team's 2024 NFL draft class, and I'm aware that the draft was 2 weeks ago. We've moved past the cycle of NFL draft content. It's time to move on to other stuff, but here's the thing. Life has been busy over the last couple of weeks. I haven't had time to do this, and I wanted to make it a point to get this video done at some point. So today is going to be that day. We're going to recap each team's draft class by ranking them from 32 all the way to number 1. We're not going to waste any time. Let's get started. So as you can see, each team will be put into its own tier with a letter grade, and each letter grade has its own description from 1 A+ draft, which goes to the team who did the best, all the way down to the D grade. And there's only one team that's going to be here in the D section, and that is, to the surprise of probably nobody, the Atlanta Falcons. The more I think about their draft, the less sense it makes to me. So much of this poor grade revolves around the selection of Michael Penix Jr. with the 8th overall pick. One of the biggest bombshells really in recent draft memory, because nobody could have seen it coming with the recent signing of Kirk Cousins. And there just isn't really a whole lot I can rationalize with this selection, other than the fact that Atlanta recognizes that this is a quarterback prospect they really like, and given that, they don't want to let him slip through the cracks. And I get that. But I very strongly disagree with the fact that he's some can't-miss guy. He was my third quarterback ranked on the board at the time. I had a higher grade on both J.J. McCarthy and Bo Nix. And I think especially McCarthy would make a lot more sense given his overall upside sitting behind a guy like Kirk Cousins, which is the next part of this. They gave Kirk Cousins $45 million over the next 4 years. The best opportunity that your team has a chance to win with a young quarterback is during their rookie contract, because you don't have to pay them big money and instead can focus on other positions. Well, the problem here with Atlanta is that during Penix's rookie deal, they're going to be paying Kirk Cousins all this money. They do, I believe, have an opt-out after the second year in Kirk's contract, so at some point they could theoretically move on from him for a limited cost and slide Penix in there. But that would also imply that the Kirk Cousins signing was a failure, and that $45 million a year investment proved to be a mistake. And for this front office, I feel like they don't exactly have time to waste, given that this is now their 4th draft, or at least the 4th under general manager Terry Fontenot. And at some point, this team has to win games. They haven't picked any better than 8th since hiring Fontenot all the way back in 2021. So say the Kirk Cousins signing fails, I would have to think that Fontenot and others in the staff very well could be fired before Michael Penix even really gets the chance to play. Along with the Penix pick, which that in and of itself was a disaster, I thought the rest of their class was also kind of underwhelming. I don't love the trade up for Rook Oro in the second round, and I like Oro a lot. I'm higher on him than consensus, and I don't even hate the value of him being the 35th pick. But why move up 8 spots? There were higher regarded interior defensive linemen on the board, such as Johnny Newton and T'Vondre Sweat, who both obviously went before the 43rd pick. I just don't see the need to trade another top 100 pick to move up and get Oro. The rest of their class I felt like was underwhelming. Braylon Trice is fine. Their day 3 picks were fine. But there's really nothing redeeming about this draft class for Atlanta, and I feel like they had a golden opportunity to get a great defensive player like Laiatu Latu or Dallas Turner or Byron Murphy, or maybe even add Roma Dunze to the offense, and I feel like they just completely whiffed. They overthought it, and I think personally this will be a big mistake down the line. Now we've got my C-graded drafts, and these classes I feel like are all very subpar. I will say there are less teams in the C category than there have been in the past, which more so speaks to that I don't think there are a lot of teams who had bad drafts. But these 6 teams I feel like all could have done quite a bit better. We'll start with the Tennessee Titans, who are my 31st ranked draft with a C- grade. I'm just not a huge fan of the players they picked. I think J.C. Latham at 7 is a really big reach. I think there were better offensive tackles on the board, whether they're more polished or have more upside. I think there's players who fit that bill over J.C. Latham. And if they really wanted to focus on value, I think they could have looked at another position as well. Rome Odunze would have been a really strong pick. I wouldn't have even hated the idea of going defense here. I get that offensive line is the big need on this team, tackle specifically, but they could have moved back a little bit and got like a Talise Fuanga or an Amarius Mims, two guys who I think are significantly better prospects than J.C. Latham. So that selection in the first round I felt like was just a disaster. I'm not a huge fan of the T'Vondre Sweat pick in the second round. I feel like he was a little bit overdrafted, and that's not to mention the character concerns that he has. And it's not just the DUI that he had a couple weeks before the draft, although boy, that does not help. But he's had character questions dating back to his career at Texas. So this was a cloud that was already hanging over him that he likely knew about. And he had to go in the offseason with the idea that I'm going to prove these teams wrong and show that I am a high character guy. And what does he do? DUI. Not a good look. Again, I thought the rest of their draft was overall subpar, and it doesn't really make up for the C- grade. My 30th ranked team is the Washington Commanders. On one hand, I actually really like much of their class overall, but man, I think they missed on the second overall pick. I think that Drake May is comfortably the second best quarterback in this draft. So to pass on him for Jaden Daniels, I feel like it's going to be a big mistake for this team. I have a lot of questions about Daniels' game in terms of his ability as a passer up the middle of the field, in terms of the fact that he took 5 years to break out at LSU. And sure, there are some redeeming qualities about him. I think he's got a better floor. Obviously, he's better as a runner. But I think the overall upside that Drake May has made him the clear choice for me here at number 2. And the fact that they didn't do that, going with Jaden Daniels, I think is going to be a really big mistake for them. And the fact that they missed on the quarterback, in my opinion, is what's going to set the rest of this class back. Even though, again, I thought the rest of their draft really was not that bad. Johnny Newton in the second round. Very solid pick. Now, there are some medical question marks about him. He had the foot issue that plagued him throughout the offseason, and now we recently find out that his other foot just got operated on. So that's kind of the concern now. But regardless, he's a really talented player who probably belonged in the first round, and I think the value of that was really solid. Mike Sainristil, I love that pick in the middle of the second round. This is the first year with the Dan Quinn and Adam Peters regime, and what Washington needs is culture builders, and that's exactly what Mike Sainristil is. Big-time leader, big-time culture guy at the University of Michigan, and it doesn't hurt that he is a darn good football player, whether you put him in the nickel, which is probably where he's going to primarily line up, on the outside. I'm not entirely sure if he'll be able to hold up there being a smaller guy. Maybe he can play safety. I've always been a fan of receivers converted to defensive backs because I think it gives you an edge in terms of overall ball skills. So that's something that very well could fire Sainristil to the next level. Ben Sinot, the Kansas State tight end, was also a solid pick. So overall, I thought they did good in the second round. Round 3, not so much. Brandon Coleman and Luke McCaffrey were both overdrafted, and the rest of their class was fine. Nothing exciting. But I think they whiffed in the first round, which is the biggest thing. And ultimately, there's only so much you can do through the rest of the class to make up for a disastrous move at the start. The Baltimore Ravens are one of those teams who I feel like has earned the benefit of the doubt because they have such a high track record in terms of player acquisition through the draft and player development as well. Historically, they're a team who have always scored very highly for me in my draft grades, but I've got to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the haul. We'll start with Nate Wiggins at the end of the first round. I thought that pick was fine. I mean, I think there are better players at his position on the board. I would have preferred one of Kool-Aid McKinstry or Cooper DeJean. I have a lot more questions with Nate Wiggins in terms of obviously his size, how it's going to affect him in the run game, his durability because of his lack of frame. But he's an intriguing cover corner. I think he's got a ton of upside. And again, the Ravens are one of the teams who I would trust to develop him. The reason why I'm not as high on their class, though, is I'm just not all that high on a lot of the guys they drafted, which seems to be opposite of consensus. The Ravens drafted a lot of players who were high on consensus boards, who I happen to be lower on. Roger Rosengarten at pick 61 I feel like is fine. I thought there were better players available on the board. And then some of their next few picks with Adiza Isaac, TJ Tampa, and Tez Walker. Everybody's calling those guys steals because they were ranked in the 50s on the PFF board. But I was significantly lower on all of those guys, and I'm just not a huge believer in any of them. So because of that, the Ravens draft grade tanks quite a bit, and that's why I've got them this low. The Rams are another team who also has deserved the benefit of the doubt. But again, I'm not a huge fan of their haul. I do like their pick in the first round with Jared Verse. I think he's a good player, probably the best player at that position. And the Rams have done a great job developing the defensive line here for the post-Aaron Donald era. Third-rounders, Kobe Turner and Byron Young both look like hits. Now you add Jared Verse to the puzzle, and I think that's going to be a big piece for them. The rest of their class, though, was not the best. I thought their move to trade up for Braden Fisk was a really bad one, and really the whole move didn't make sense to me. In terms of the trade itself, moving up 13 spots from 52 to 39 and giving up a second-round pick next year is horrible value. Along with that, I don't even think they made that good of the pick with Braden Fisk, and I would have viewed him as a reach at pick 52. Another guy who I wasn't that high on. He was great during the pre-draft process. Really good Senior Bowl, really good combine. But I thought as a prospect, he was a little bit overrated. More of the late second, early third round guy for me. So to move up and give away all of that future draft capital, I think that was one of the worst moves of the draft. The Blake Corum pick is an interesting one. I feel like his skill set is very similar to Kyren Williams, which on one hand, it's like, how is Corum going to see the field early on? But on the other hand, I think it does make a little bit of sense because the Rams probably are not going to want to pay Kyren Williams long term. This gets them a very easy replacement with Blake Corum, who's got a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses. I thought Cameron Kitchens was a fine pick at the end of the third round. I thought they had a lackluster day 3, but again, this is the same team who has drafted Kyren Williams and Puka Nacua in day 3 over the past 2 years. So again, I feel like they've earned the benefit of the doubt. But outside of Jared Verse and I guess the 2 third-rounders, I didn't think their class was very good. That brings us to the New England Patriots, and I feel like they nailed the first round and they whiffed the rest of the draft. I don't want to give them too much credit for picking Drake May because that felt like the obvious pick at number 3, but I'll give them a little bit of credit because a certain team ahead of them also had the obvious pick of choosing Drake May and didn't do that. So I'll give New England a little pat on the back there. I think New England made the right calls to not accept trade-ups from the Giants or the Vikings, and from what we've seen of those leaked trade offers, they didn't look all that good. So I think New England made the right move to say no to those and ultimately pick Drake May, who again, I've made it clear, was my QB2 in this class. I think he's closer to Caleb Williams than he is to anybody else. I will say I like the Patriots' philosophy of focusing on the offensive side of the ball because that's obviously where they've needed to address now that they have the young quarterback. I'm just not a huge fan of their value. Jalen Polk in the early second round, I don't hate it. I feel like it's a little bit early, though, especially considering some of the other receivers who went after him. In the third round, I thought they kind of whiffed a little bit with Caden Wallace and then Layden Robinson early in the fourth. Again, I like that they're addressing the offensive line, but I feel like both of those guys were overdrafted. I am intrigued by Javon Baker from UCF, the wide receiver in round 4. He's a guy I've been pretty high on throughout the process, and I thought their day 3 was pretty solid, but outside of making the obvious Drake May pick, there weren't really many selections here that I thought were really good. And because of that, I'm going to give them a C+. But if Drake May ends up being the guy who I think he'll be, then I would understand if you want to put this grade a lot higher. The last team in the C tier is the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are very similar to New England in the sense that they nailed it in round 1, but the rest of their draft was a train wreck. So I thought they might have had a better day 1 than anybody. Moving down, I think, 6 spots with the Minnesota Vikings, getting an absolute haul. I think they got a 3rd, a 4th, and maybe a 5th as well, just to move down from 17 to 23. And they picked Brian Thomas Jr., who would have been a pretty good pick at number 17. It was pretty obvious that this team needed another pass catcher. They could not go into a pivotal season of Trevor Lawrence's development with the weapons that they currently have. So I thought that pick and that trade was really good. Trent Baalke masterclass. The problem is the rest of their class was a Trent Baalke disaster class. Mason Smith in the second round I thought was overdrafted. Really high ceiling, ton of upside, but I feel like that was a bit rich for my liking. Jerrion Jones and Javon Foster, both fine picks after that, but other than those two, I thought their day 3 was pretty bad. And as good as they did in round 1, I can't give them a higher grade than this. If not for round 1, though, with Brian Thomas, they would be at best 31st, maybe 32nd. That's how bad I thought the rest of Jacksonville's class was overall, especially considering Trent Baalke has earned the opposite of the benefit of the doubt outside of the first round, where historically he's done a really poor job. Pretty much half of the league makes it into the B category. I feel like all these teams had solid drafts, nothing to be overly excited about, but they did fine. We'll start with the Buffalo Bills. I like how they navigated through the first round with their double trade back, only moving down a few spots, especially that second trade back with Carolina. They only moved down one spot. They were able to trade up into day 3, and I would argue that pick 33 might be more valuable than pick 32 because of A, the financial aspect of a first rounder versus a second rounder, and then B, I feel like 33 as a whole has plenty of value because outside of the first round, when there's that 18-hour dead period between pick 32 and 33, you're going to have a lot of teams calling you and an opportunity to make a big move with that pick. Ultimately, the Bills stuck at 33 with Keon Coleman, who has become a media darling over the last couple of weeks. And kind of similarly with Jalen Polk, I thought it was a fine pick, but given some of the other receivers that went in that area and went after him, I don't think it's anything super crazy. Cole Bishop in the second round I thought was picked a little bit early, but not a huge issue with that. Dwayne Carter in the third round was fine. I thought their day 3 picks were also fine. Ray Davis is cool. Cedric Van Prangranger, I think, is a pretty solid pick. So the Bills didn't necessarily do bad. There isn't a move here that I really dislike, but there also isn't anything here that I really do like, and because of that, they'll get a B-. The Dolphins also get a B-. I feel like their draft was more all over the place, though. Chop Robinson and Patrick Paul aren't bad picks, but I do have some question marks. I feel like both players are quite raw, especially for a Dolphins team that lost a lot of pieces over the offseason. I'll never be a fan of trading third-round picks for day 3 selections, and that's what Miami did, trading a 2025 third-rounder to move up into the 4th for Jalen Wright. Now, I will say the Dolphins are expected to have multiple high compensatory picks next year, including possibly 2 in the 3rd round with losing Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt. So trading their third-rounder next year is a little bit more defensible than some of the other teams who did it. But still, I can't say I love the value. I am intrigued by Jalen Wright because obviously he's a pretty big fit for the offense, being that he's an ultra speedster. The health with Devon Achane seems to be a question. Raheem Mostert has always had health questions, and he's one of the oldest starting running backs in the league. So the pick itself I have no problem with, and I actually think their day 3 overall was pretty good with Mo Kamara, Malik Washington, and Taj Washington. 2 smaller receivers who I think are both going to have an opportunity to make the roster, and we're both undervalued, I feel like, by the league. And then Mo Kamara, I feel like, as well, is a pretty good player. The Minnesota Vikings get a B. I like what the Vikings did to start. I really thought they were going to have to move into the top 5 for J.J. McCarthy. So the fact that they only had to move up one spot and were patient, letting the board play out and still getting their quarterback is a huge win. And I think the J.J. McCarthy pick makes a lot of sense. It's obvious that this team needs a quarterback. He's got a high ceiling, and I think Minnesota's the place to develop with a strong coaching staff, a strong culture, and a really good group of skill position players. What I cannot get behind is their general manager, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah's trading ability, because my God, the dude cannot trade. I thought his move to get McCarthy was fine, but I think the Dallas Turner trade package was completely inexcusable. I don't mind trading up for Dallas Turner in a vacuum. He probably shouldn't have fallen to pick 17, and I think the pick itself was a pretty good one. But moving up 6 spots, giving up a 3rd rounder, a 4th rounder, and more is just not good value whatsoever. And Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah has had a history of making bad draft day trades that have ultimately flopped. When the Lions moved up to trade up for Jamison Williams, they fleeced him. When the Packers moved up to get Christian Watson, they fleeced him. Kwesi does not understand trade value. The Vikings only have 3 picks going into next year, only one of which is before the 5th round. I thought their day 3 was fine. I like Kyrie Jackson. He is certainly an older prospect, but I think he's pretty good. So I don't really have an issue with that pick, and the rest of their selections were fine. But, man, the Dallas Turner trade package just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. That'll bring us to the Carolina Panthers. I thought their value throughout the draft was okay, but I do like their strategy, really, of the entire offseason. In free agency, it was build a wall around Bryce Young, and now here in the draft, it's give him weapons. I felt like trading up one spot for Xavier Legette was unnecessary, and as I mentioned when we were talking about the Bills, I feel like pick 33 is more value than pick 32, with the exception of having the 5th-year option, which is still very expensive. Now, again, I don't have an issue with the selection of Xavier Legette, but once again, I feel like there were good receivers picked in that same range or even after. So I feel like they could have made better value, but the pick itself, I don't have a major problem with. I love their move to trade back in the second round with the Rams. And as I mentioned, I hate that move for the Rams, giving up a future second rounder to move up 13 spots for Braden Fisk, while Carolina moves back up for Jonathan Brooks. I feel like Carolina didn't need to move up for a running back. When you're drafting a running back, it generally symbolizes that your team is only a couple pieces away, and obviously that is not the case with Carolina. I still don't hate it, though, because Brooks was my top-ranked running back in the class, and add on to the fact that you want to build a multi-dimensional offense. You want to make Bryce Young's life easier, and I do think Jonathan Brooks can be a three-down back. So that I thought was fine. Jatavion Sanders in the fourth round, also not a bad pick. I'm intrigued by his overall upside. So overall, I give Carolina a B. I feel like they could have done better, but they also could have done a lot worse. The Packers will get a B grade. Jordan Morgan in the first round, in a vacuum, isn't a bad pick, but I feel like they could have gotten such better players. Graham Barton was the very next pick. I was praying that Green Bay wouldn't have gotten him. Corner was a big need. I feel like any of the corners would have made more sense as well. I do think the rest of their draft was quite good. In the second round, Edgerrin Cooper I thought was a solid pick. I don't know if I would have made him the first linebacker off the board. I thought Junior Colson from Michigan is the better prospect, but I don't hate it. I really like picking Javon Bullard late in the second round. He's a guy I've had linked with the Packers for quite a while before the draft itself. I thought that was a really good move by them. The rest of their draft I don't think was that great, though. Marshawn Lloyd in round 3 is fine. I feel like he could be a good complement with Josh Jacobs. Tyron Hopper and Evan Williams were both overdrafted, but I thought the rest of their day 3 was pretty good. Michael Pratt in the 7th round was really good value. So overall, the Packers draft kind of all over the map, but I'm going to give them a B. That brings us to the Detroit Lions, my 20th ranked draft, and pretty much every ranking you'll see, the Lions are higher than this. Everybody's giving the Lions really high grades, and I disagree. And it's kind of ironic because last year, everybody had the Lions towards the bottom, and I disagreed with that too. I defended Detroit's draft class last year through the mud, and I was very clearly right. Now, obviously, I didn't even expect it to be as good as it was. I only gave it a B. I thought the Jahmyr Gibbs pick was better than people thought. I thought the Jack Campbell pick was better than people thought. I couldn't have expected Sam Laporta to be an all-pro, but that's neither here nor there. The one move that the Lions made that I do really like is trading up for Terrion Arnold. I thought the value was really good of getting him at pick 24. And sure, the price was steep, giving away a third-round pick, but there was a 0% chance Terrion Arnold was going to make it to 29 with teams like the Packers, the Bucs, and the Cardinals all needing corners picking before Detroit, Buffalo as well, arguably. So I thought that move was a really good one, but I feel like the rest of their draft was honestly not that good. Ennis Rakestraw, I thought, was overdrafted. Everybody's calling this pick a steal because, again, he was ranked highly on the consensus boards, and I disagree with it. I have a lot of questions with Ennis Rakestraw. I thought his production was overhyped. His ball skills are overhyped. His athleticism isn't all that. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think Ennis Rakestraw is as good of a prospect as people think. And then once we get to day 3, I feel like Brad Holmes might have gotten a little bit arrogant. And let me just say right now, I love Brad Holmes. He's awesome. He's done a tremendous job building this roster. And if anybody deserves to be a little bit arrogant, it probably is him. He feels like your role-playing three-point shooter who's made a couple threes in a row is starting to get hot and wants to go for the step back 5 feet behind the three-point line. And again, Brad Holmes has earned the opportunity to do that, and my trust has not wavered with him. He's one of the best general managers in the NFL, but I am confused by some of his moves on day 3, particularly trading a third-round pick next year to move up for the Canadian offensive lineman Giovanni Manu. He's an intriguing athlete with a lot of upside, and if there's any team to develop him, it probably is Detroit with offensive line coach Hank Fraley. But giving up a third-round pick for a guy who's a major wild card like that is ballsy. And if it works out, power to him. But in the case that it doesn't, you just threw away a top 100 pick. Moving up again for Sione Vaki also felt kind of ballsy. Vaki could be a fun player. Experience on both sides of the ball, primarily as a safety at Utah, although I think the Lions are going to use him more on the offensive side of the ball, as well as obviously special teams. I don't love that Brad Holmes pretty much traded up for every pick. I get that Brad and the Lions have their guys, and I feel like that's a good thing to have. Developing certain players who you identify as your guys. But moving up for all of them really is not ideal. I will say the Lions kind of saved themselves at the end. Mekhi Wingo and Christian Mahogany later on day 3 were both really good value picks. But I've got questions. I've got a lot of questions. I believe in Brad. I love the guy, but I've got questions. Next up, we've got the Las Vegas Raiders. No major complaints here. I'm fine with the Brock Bowers pick. I certainly didn't expect it. I was completely convinced they were going to pick Talise Fuanga because I feel like it was a very similar sort of process to what their current general manager, Tom Telesco, did a few years ago with Rashawn Slater. A tackle with shorter arms who probably can stick at tackle, but a lot of people are deeming as more of the guard. Obviously, Slater is stuck at tackle, and he's been really good. And with that being a big need for the Raiders, I felt like that was the route they were going to go with, especially considering Fuanga did fall to their pick. But Bowers is a dynamic player. I don't question how they're going to use him. I get they drafted Michael Mayer in the second round last year, but these two guys are completely different players, so I don't really see a major issue with it. Jackson Powers-Johnson in the second round I thought was really good value. I think he's a first-round player. I think he's the best interior offensive lineman in the class. I thought that was a phenomenal selection. I thought the rest of their draft was pretty bleh, though, which ultimately drops their grade. I don't mind Delmar Glaze in the third round as much as other people do, but I feel like that was still a little bit rich. I do like selecting Decamarion Richardson, the corner out of Mississippi State. He's an intriguing, toolsy corner, and I feel like that's often the way to go when you're drafting defensive backs on day 3. Look for guys who have the physical upside and the tools to be really good. The Dallas Cowboys get a B. I like that they moved back in the first round, adding an additional top 100 pick. The Tyler Guyton selection is fine. I don't love Guyton as a prospect, but to move back for him, and obviously with Dallas's track record of developing offensive linemen, I'm cool with it. I thought the rest of their draft was pretty good too. Marshawn Nealon in the second round was a strong pick. Cooper Beebe in the third round is a total steal. Beebe's probably the biggest my guy in this class. I had a top 30 grade on him, and if they had picked him at 29, I would not have batted an eye in the slightest. My question, though, is the lack of drafting offensive skill position players, because with the exception of CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson, this might be the worst group of skill position players I've ever laid my eyes on in my entire life. Ezekiel Elliott, Rico Dowdle, Deuce Vaughn, and Royce Freeman are starting running back candidates. Yikes. They could have easily drafted someone in the third or fourth round, or even a guy like Trey Benson in round 2, and you're going to have one of the better starting running backs in the league, I feel like, very early on. But instead, you've got this. Their receiving core is also a mess. CeeDee Lamb is great. Top 5 receiver in the league probably. But the rest of that room is not good. Jalen Tolbert and Brandon Cooks do not move me, unfortunately. Now, I get you have to focus on value over need, and I feel like overall they got good value across the board. But even on day 3, you could have gotten a solid running back or receiver. There were good ones available. So I question who Dak is going to be able to give the ball to next year, but I still give Dallas a B because their value overall was pretty good. The Houston Texans get a B. Now we're really moving towards the average and eventually above average classes. The Texans, of course, did not have a first rounder. I thought that trade was pretty stupid, moving back 20 spots a month before the draft to acquire, albeit probably a high-ish second rounder next year from Minnesota. But I feel like that was an unnecessary move that they didn't need to make then. I will say I thought their class was pretty solid. Kamari Lassiter obviously has launch speed questions, but I think both him and Blake Fisher were pretty good picks for the second round. I thought Kalen Bullock was a little bit overdrafted. I'm not as high on him. I thought there were better safeties on the board, but it's not a terrible pick. Cade Stover is intriguing, but there are some health concerns. Overall, nothing spectacular, but not a bad class, I would say. The New York Jets are going to get a B here as well. Certainly hurt watching Roma Dunze go one pick before them. I imagine he would have been the easy choice at number 10. But I like that they were able to pivot, move back, get some extra picks from Minnesota, and still get Olu Fashanu, who's really not a bad consolation prize at all. with Odunze off the board, I feel like there wasn't an obvious pick for them. I thought they would pick Brock Bowers because I feel like that's what Aaron Rodgers would prefer. And given that the Jets probably want to contend this year, I feel like Bowers gives them the best chance to do that. But I still don't hate picking offensive line because obviously it's a high position of value. And if Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses get hurt, which is very possible, they're both on the older side, Olu Fashanu can slide in. Now, I will say, I feel like this pick doesn't really raise the Jets' ceiling much because of the fact that they added Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses, who are both older tackles, but both of them are still quite good. I feel like people don't realize that the Jets now have one of the best tackle duos in the league, and it's really just about health and age with those two. But for just this season, if those two guys stay healthy, it's going to be one of the better duos in the league, I feel like. I thought their remaining draft picks were fine. They really focused on the offensive side of the ball, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. That was obviously their weakness. I like Malachi Corley in the third round. I'm not as high on him as others, but I thought that pick was fine value. I think if nothing else, he can be an intriguing gadget player who could possibly be a little bit more than that. Jordan Travis in day 3, I don't have a problem with. Gets another developmental quarterback in the building. I do have questions with doubling down at running back with Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis. Neither of those picks in a vacuum were poor value, but I don't really know how they're going to see the field because Breece Hall's a workhorse 3-down back. They've drafted running backs on day 3 every year with Joe Douglas. They did it in 2021 with Michael Carter. Obviously, Breece Hall in 2022. He wasn't a day 3 pick, but he was still a Joe Douglas pick. Last year, Izzy Abanikanda, a player who I was quite high on throughout the pre-draft process. Now, clearly, the fact that they're picking 2 backs here signals that they don't believe in Abanikanda, so it looks like I missed there. So even if they had picked 1 running back, I wouldn't really question it, but why 2? I feel like that's kind of pointless. Other than that, the rest of their class wasn't all that spectacular, and they will end up with a B. The New Orleans Saints get a B+. I thought they had a pretty good draft. I haven't been very high on their roster construction over the last few years, but this weekend, I feel like they did pretty well. Talise Fuanga at 14, no problems with it. There were a couple tackles who I thought might have been a little bit better than him, but I don't have an issue with it. Moving up for Kool-Aid McKinstry in the second round, I thought was a good pick. I think the value with him at pick, I think it was 41, is really good, so I have no problem trading up for him because I think he's fantastic. They didn't pick again until the 5th round where they drafted Spencer Rattler. I'm not as high on Rattler as some, but for round 5, I have no complaints. And if Derek Carr does struggle this year, I wouldn't be surprised to see Rattler get some playing time. The one mistake New Orleans can make here is what Washington did with Sam Howell, to where Rattler plays a little bit, he doesn't look half bad, and they turn him into the starter for a year or two and kind of waste that season because I'm not convinced that Spencer Rattler is ever going to be a good NFL starter. But nonetheless, I thought New Orleans did a pretty good job. The Denver Broncos are a team who have scored really low for a lot of people, and I disagree with it. I'm higher on Bo Nix. Maybe there's a little Oregon bias, but having followed him over the last 2 years, he's improved so much from his time at Auburn, and I feel like there's a lot more to his game than people give him credit for. He can make all the throws downfield. People like to call him a screen merchant, and sure, a lot of his throws were underneath in an easier, gimmicky college offense, but he can make the downfield throws, and much of that was with deep threat Troy Franklin, who is now on his team after the Broncos moved up for him in the 4th round. I thought that was really good value. I think he's as good, if not better, than some of the receivers who went in the 2nd round. I have my questions about Troy Franklin, how his play strength is going to be able to hold up in the NFL, but for round 4, I feel like that's really good value. And then Jonah Ellis in the 3rd round as well. I feel like as a total steal, he was a top 50 player for me. I think he's really good, and I think that was a great selection for them. And I thought the rest of their day 3 was fine as well. Chris Abrams-Drain I like quite a bit. Audric Estime is pretty intriguing. Overall, I feel like they did pretty well, and that's because I'm higher on Bo Nix than others. And sure, the value at 12 isn't ideal, but all the other quarterbacks were gone. You're not going to be able to trade down and most likely get him. I don't think that's a gamble you should be willing to take. So sticking at 12 and getting Bo Nix, I think is going to be the right move, and I thought the rest of their class was pretty good. The Colts are going to get a B+ as well. Health permitting, I think Laiatu Latu very well could be the best defensive player in the draft. And at pick 15, I really like that move. They moved down in the 2nd round, still ending up with Adonai Mitchell. And I've got my questions with Mitchell, but I see the upside with him. And if he hits his ceiling, oh boy, look out. I thought both of those picks were really good. I thought the rest of their draft wasn't great, though, which is why they're not going to be in the A category. I do like Tanner Bortolini, the offensive lineman out of Wisconsin, but other than that, I thought their picks outside of rounds 1 and 2 were not all that good. The 49ers get a B+. I've graded the 49ers very low in recent years, so this is a pleasant development. I'm higher on Ricky Pearsall than others. I still feel like 31 was a bit high, but I'm not going to completely complain about it because I think Pearsall is pretty good. I thought the rest of their draft, though, was awesome. Renardo Green and Dominic Pooney in the second and third rounds, I thought were really good picks. I liked their day 3 as well. Jacob Cowan's a guy who I think has been slept on because of his size. I think the Niners overall had a pretty good draft, one of their better ones in recent years. And look out for Isaac Guerendo as well, the running back out of Louisville. If he hits his upside, he could be intriguing. The Cardinals are going to get a B+. Last year, they were my 1A+. This year, I don't think they did as good, but still pretty solid. I like Marvin Harrison at 4. No need to overthink it. Sure, they could have traded down and gotten a lot, but they already have a lot of draft assets, so why not get the blue chip talent? And Maserati Marv was my number 1 overall ranked player in the entire draft. The rest of their class, I feel like, was up and down. Darius Robinson at the end of the first round, I feel like is fine. I'm intrigued to see how he's going to fit this Jonathan Gannon defense, and I do think Jonathan Gannon is the type of coach who can get the most out of him. I like what they did early in the second round, moving back, adding another third rounder, and picking Max Melton, the corner out of Rutgers. I think Max Melton is pretty good. He's a guy who a lot of people thought was going to be more of a third or fourth rounder. I said, no, this guy's going to go in the top 50. And, well, I was right. Trey Benson, I also think is a great pick. I had him right up there with Jonathan Brooks in contention for RB1. And I think Trey Benson's going to be one of the better running backs in the league pretty early on. If you have the chance to draft him in fantasy, do it. He's going to be good. I thought they overdrafted with their other third rounders, but they made up for it on day 3 with Dadrian Taylor-Demerson and Christian Jones. Had they picked those guys in the third round over the 2 Illinois prospects, Isaiah Adams and Tip Ryman, I wouldn't have really batted an eye, and I probably would have given them an A- or even an A. Overall, I feel like the Cardinals did pretty well, and I really like the job that Monty Ossenfort has done through his first 2 years here. My last B team is the Los Angeles Chargers. I know their fans did not want offensive line because it wasn't that big of a need for them. Malik Neighbors was on the board at pick 5. I probably would have picked Neighbors, but really thinking about it, ending up with Joe Alt and Ladd McConkey in the first 2 rounds, that's a really good combination. Joe Alt is a phenomenal offensive tackle prospect, probably the best one since Penei Sewell, and there have been some good tackle prospects in recent years. And then moving up for Ladd McConkey, I have no problems with that move. I'm very high on McConkey, and considering the other receivers that went in that range, such as Xavier Legette, Troy Franklin, Jalen Polk, Ricky Pearsall, I think I had McConkey ranked higher than all of those guys. So I think at 34, I have no problems with that value. Junior Colson in the third round, I thought was really good value. He was my top linebacker in the entire class, ahead of guys like Edgerrin Cooper and Peyton Wilson. And I thought day 3 they did pretty solid. Cam Hart and Kimani Vidal, I thought were both pretty good picks. So overall, I feel like people have kind of hated on the Chargers draft a little bit, and I disagree with it. I think they did pretty well. They're going to come in the 10 spot for my rankings. Now we get to the good stuff, my A grades. We'll start with the Pittsburgh Steelers, who get an A-. People have been very high on the Steelers class, and understandably so. I thought they did a really good job. Troy Fautanu with the 20th pick in the first round. I like that move. I think he's a good player. No complaints. In the second round, they ended up with Zach Frazier, who I was a little bit lower on than consensus, but at pick 51 or whatever, totally fine with it. Roman Wilson and Peyton Wilson in the third round I thought were both pretty solid. 2 guys who, again, I was lower on than consensus. They ended up going later than consensus, but I feel like the value there was absolutely fine, especially with Peyton Wilson. I think he's going to be a really good fit in this defense, and obviously there's a ton of health question marks with him because he has numerous ailments to his body, but if he can stay on the field, which I don't feel all that good about, but if he does, I think he could be pretty good. And then on day 3, Mason McCormick, the guard out of South Dakota State. I thought he should have gone on day 2. Would not have batted an eye if he went in the second round even. So I thought they had a good draft. The Buccaneers get an A- as well. I thought Graham Barton at 26 was a really good pick. He had no business falling that far. I didn't really peg Barton as a guy who could go to the Bucs, but I think the pick was a really good one. He'll probably play center at the next level, although you can put him pretty much anywhere on the offensive line. Chris Braswell in the second round I thought was fine. I'm lower on him than consensus, but I don't think it's a terrible pick. Jalen McMillan and Bucky Irving I feel like are going to be fun additions to the offense. And then Tyke Smith, one of the most underrated players in the draft class, in my opinion, going to the Buccaneers at the end of the third round, I thought was outstanding value. So overall, I thought Tampa did quite well. The Giants are going to get an A- as well. Obviously, there were rumblings of them wanting a quarterback, and I would not have complained at all had they given up a lot to go up and get Drake May, but ultimately they don't. And I like the fact that they didn't panic. They didn't force a quarterback pick. I wouldn't have been a huge fan of J.J. McCarthy at 6 because, well, I'm not sure he's set to succeed here. I do like him with Brian Daboll, but I don't like him with this supporting cast. So I think getting the top value of Malik Neighbors, who was my, I think, second or third overall ranked player in the entire draft, I thought was the best pick they could have made. He was the number one player for me on the board. Tyler Nubin and Andrew Phillips were both strong selections in day 2. I feel like they're each going to really help the secondary. And then I'm intrigued by the upside with some of these day 3 picks. Theo Johnson is a really high ceiling, the tight end out of Penn State. And Purdue running back Tyrone Tracy, I feel like could be a strong pick as well. The Cleveland Browns get an A-. The Browns have not had a first-round pick in about 4 years, but despite that, the Browns always find themselves towards the top of my draft grades. This year's no different. I thought they did quite well. Michael Hall in the second round I thought was a really strong value pick. I think he's got some intriguing upside. Zach Zinter in the third round I thought was pretty good. Obviously, he had the injury against Ohio State, but I think he's pretty solid. Jamari Thrash, the receiver out of Louisville, for round 5. I thought that was a steal. I didn't think he had any business falling that far. Sure, Andrew Berry does not have a high track record of evaluating wide receivers, but I think for the 5th round, Jamari Thrash was a really good pick. The Kansas City Chiefs are going to get an A-. I'm a lot higher on the Chiefs class this year than just about anybody, and I think that's because of my opinion on Xavier Worthy, who I really believe in. If Xavier Worthy ran 10 seconds slower, I feel like people would be higher on him, and I think it's just because of the fact that players who generally have ran under 4.3, especially at receiver, have not panned out in the NFL. I think Xavier Worthy is the guy who's going to break the trend because all those guys who ran sub 4.3 did not have the collegiate production that Xavier Worthy did, a 3-year starter since his true freshman season at the University of Texas. Really, really good player, and obviously is going to be a great fit in this offense. So I think Xavier Worthy to the Chiefs was a really good pick. No complaints moving up for him, and if he hits his ceiling, my God, why did the NFL let the Chiefs get their hands on him? I like what they did with the offensive line. Kingsley Suamatea in the second round is a guy who I know they liked. I thought he was in play for them in the first round. Hunter Nerzad out of Penn State, I think, has some good upside. Jared Wiley and Jaden Hicks were both also pretty good day 3 picks. So overall, great draft for the Chiefs. Brett Veach has done it again. Now, my 4th ranked draft goes to the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks were a team who everybody graded highly last year, and I kind of disagreed with it. I think I gave them a B last year when everybody was handing them A's. And I think I was more wrong than right. Devin Witherspoon in particular, I think I was lower on him than I should have been. So my apologies, Seattle. Here's your high grade of an A-. And thinking about it, even that might be a little bit low in hindsight. Byron Murphy in the first round I think is really good. I think he's one of the best defensive players in this draft class, and I think he's going to be a stud. Christian Haynes in the 3rd round I thought was a steal. He had no business falling there. I thought that was great value. And then on day 3, I was a little underwhelmed, but I thought they did fine. There were some picks that really had to be scratching my head, such as Tyrese Knight, the linebacker out of UTEP. But I do like picking both of the Auburn corners, Nehemiah Pritchett and DJ James, 2 guys who, again, are toolsy. James is on the smaller side, kind of like Nate Wiggins in terms of his build with a lack of weight. But for day 3, I don't really have a major issue with it, and I thought they hit a home run with their first 2 picks. The Chicago Bears get an A-, and this doesn't even really account for picking Caleb Williams because, as I kind of talked about with Drake May, I don't think he should get credit for making the obvious pick. It's like a kid taking their test. The most important part of the test is to put your name on it, but you don't get any credit for it. I feel like that's kind of how I view the Caleb Williams pick. The Bears don't deserve to be applauded for making the obvious choice, but they did, so good for them. The reason why I gave them an A- is I thought they did really good otherwise with the lack of picks they had. Roma Dunze at 9. Don't overthink it. No need to move back. I thought that was an A+ pick. Kiran Amagaji in the 3rd round I thought was a really good pick. Moving up to round 5 for Austin Booker I feel like is a total steal. The one question mark I have is with Torrey Taylor picking a punter as early as they did. If their offense is going to be as good as they expect, they shouldn't be having to use a 4th round pick on a punter. Now, I will say, if there's any punter who you're going to draft highly, it's the most experienced punter in the history of college football. There's more film on Taylor than any punter probably ever because of how often Iowa had to punt. So, He's more of a sure thing than just about any special teamer you'll find, and because of that, the Bears still get an A-. Had they picked a good player instead of Taylor, I probably would have had them ranked second instead of third. Wow, whoop-de-doo. The Cincinnati Bengals are my only A grade. I thought they had a phenomenal draft. Amarius Mims was one of the best picks in the first round, in my opinion. I am as a fringe top 10 player and my second offensive tackle in the entire class behind Joe Alt. I'm a huge fan of Amarius Mims. I get he's gotten a lack of reps in terms of him being raw and in terms of medical, but when he's been on the field, he's been really good. I don't think he's that raw. I think he's pretty polished for what we've seen out of him, and I think the ceiling is really high. Chris Jenkins in the second round, I feel like, was a good pick. Jermaine Burton in the third round could be really good value. There are some character questions, but if he cleans that up, then that could be really good value. Day 3, I thought they did quite well. Eric All was not a bad pick. Josh Newton, I thought was pretty good. Tanner McLaughlin, I thought was pretty solid. So overall, I thought the Bengals did fantastic, but they don't get my number 1 spot. That's reserved to the team who had the best draft. We can't keep letting them get away with it. The Philadelphia Eagles are my number 1 ranked draft. They get my only A+ grade. I have a question for the other 31 general managers. Why are you letting Howie Roseman run circles around you? Because that is exactly what he did during draft weekend. The pairing of Quinion Mitchell to Philadelphia makes a lot of sense because he was not only my number 1 ranked corner, but my number 1 ranked defensive prospect in the draft, period. I would have been happy if they moved up to get him, and in my final mock draft, I had them moving up with Jacksonville. They don't even have to trade up. The guy falls right to their laps. They let the board play out perfectly and get somebody who I feel like is a top 10 player in the class. Home run. Moving up in the second round for Cooper DeJean. Home run. No clue why he fell that far. I don't get it at all. Jalix Hunt at the end of the third round I thought was fine. I'm intrigued by the upside from the kid out of Houston Christian. And then on day 3, they knocked it out of the park, consistently making trades. And I thought their value picks were pretty good. Will Shipley, Johnny Wilson, Dylan McMahon. Really good value selections. I'm also intrigued by guys like Aina Smith and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. I thought their draft as a whole was really good, but it was Howie consistently getting the most possible value he could by adding future picks. They got multiple, I think, third rounders, multiple fourth rounders, multiple fifth rounders next year. Nobody maximized on their value in terms of trades and players selections more than Howie Roseman. And every other NFL GM needs to take a crash course on A, how Howie does it, and B, why are you letting Howie do it? Why are you still making these moves with him? I don't get it. These teams are clueless with operating with Howie Roseman because the man is a mastermind. And with that, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope everybody enjoyed. I'm really sorry for the delay, but we're here. Now that NFL draft season is done and has been done for like 2 weeks, the NBA draft is around the corner. Of course, we had the lottery earlier today, and as a Piston fan, I would like to drink bleach. And of course, plenty podcast episodes coming soon as well, so that should be fun. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.